Hey everyone, this is Building in Public episode 2. I'm building a tool called healthcareOS, which attempts to make physicians' lives easier by giving them intuitive, user-friendly tools that they can do their jobs better. In this series, I'm breaking down my kind of month-to-month progress on building this prototype, validating the idea, and possibly launching this at some point in the future. In this episode, I want to talk about 4 things. I recently launched a new feature, or kind of pseudo feature, called the module library. And I want to talk a little bit about why I did that and give you a little bit of an in-depth breakdown of the modules within that. Then I'll talk a little bit about these 2 topics, data visualization and chronic care management, as 2 things that I'm kind of still thinking about here into the next month. So let's very briefly talk about the module library. This is the demo kind of prototype app that I've been building. It's built in Vue and it's hosted at this domain. And one of this feature that I wanted to build is essentially a preview of this kind of core UX feature in this product. Now, it takes a second to load because of the data, but this is kind of a library, if you will, of these different modules as they exist in the system. Now, these modules are a core component of how a user would interact with this system. They're kind of a componentized version of different data points and data representations that are meant to be consistent and kind of cohesive so that a physician has more control over their workflow and how they view data about a particular patient. Right here you can see that this is kind of how they might look in an actual flow. So you kind of add these modules on as you need to see different information. So this patient comes in with a headache and 3 days for fever, 3 days, headaches, fatigue, muscle aches, things like that. It might be important to know the medications they're taking or see recent blood work or whatever it might be, so the physician can very quickly access that piece of data without having to go and navigate through endless menus and pages and things like that. It's kind of a componentized, modular kind of system that allows them to find the information they need. But building this particular view and this kind of system where a physician can add these blocks or modules onto each other has proven to be rather difficult for me. Even with all the ChatGPT help in the world, I'm still struggling with getting it to work properly. So the question in my mind was, how do I give someone the view of these pieces of information and be able to add to it and kind of show the robustness and kind of flexibility of this system when I'm still struggling to actually build out this kind of this engineering part myself. You can see here that in this design file that I've got a lot of different versions of these modules for things like, different lab results, a medication list, last appointment summaries, even like I'm started working on like condition views, and this is something I'll talk about in a second. But you can see there's quite a few things here, and this even goes into things like writing an email or adding a new prescription, things like that. And these things are supposed to be very robust and flexible. But it's proven to be difficult for me to kind of build out the main thing. So this idea of the module library came to mind where I can kind of have them all displayed in one centralized location where users can kind of come in and see, and they can kind of interact with it, right? It's not fully functioning here, as most of this prototype is not. But it still gives them a view into how this might work and what this information might be. So you can see I'm still kind of working through how to add these pieces of information here, but basically doing this, I think, is going to give me the ability to really quickly expand and show the offering of this feature. Now, these modules, to get a little bit more in depth into these modules, which is kind of this next thing I want to discuss, is getting into the system that powers these modules. I think that's a really important thing because these modules look fairly unique across the board, but there are a lot of commonalities and system thinking here that I think is important to point out. The first and most important thing is kind of a header and footer in each module. So in Figma, these are actually just components, and that these components have attributes. So you can see here I have header, It's got a state, it's got a title, subtitle, close button, or just this should probably just be button, and then badge. So I can toggle these things on and off depending on the context. And this kind of gives me the flexibility that I need to kind of show the information as kind of a physician is going through it. So for instance, with these headers, there might be a title, there might be a subtitle, and these are important to show like maybe the subcategory of the piece of data that they're looking at. 12 December 2020 would be a very kind of vague date and wouldn't necessarily have a lot of understanding by itself. But if we then put last appointment or, an appointment or whatever it is, then there is some more context there for the physician as they're kind of scanning across. And the goal here, as this kind of shows, is that you can kind of scan across these things very quickly and get a feel for what each data point is. So this header is a fairly important component, and it also kind of includes some different pieces of information in addition to that. Things like the badges. I think the badge is kind of a critical thing here because it does kind of indicate that there is something here that you need to know, like a very kind of high level attribute about this thing. So for instance, this kind of lipid panel, cardiac risk panel, lab results card shows most recent, right? So like that would be a very important thing for them to know if they're just kind of scanning across this, like, okay, this was the most recent lab result. This is the right thing for me to be looking at, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just something that we can easily, theoretically pull into the chart, right? That's a piece of data. That's a useful attribute that exists by looking at the the comparison of all the other lab results in the chart, right? So like that's not a complex thing, but it does add a little bit of visual recognition for the user to say, oh yeah, okay, this is the most recent thing. Or even with the systolic hypertension, based on the trends and based on all these things, we can actually just say that, hey, this is controlled. It's controlled with medication or it's controlled with diet or whatever. But again, it's kind of giving a little bit of that extra information for the user to say this is a controlled condition that your patient has. The other thing that's important to note here is some of these controls, the button controls. So a lot of them have closed little kind of times or X buttons. So there would be a close. So it'd be easy to kind of add and remove them as they need to. But some of them also have this expand button, and that's an important thing. I don't know if I have an actual design example of that. Yes, I do, kind of right here. So this is kind of what that might look like. So instead of needing to kind of go into a new page, essentially, if a user wants to get more information about this patient, the clinician is like, okay, I've seen Priscilla, I'm seeing her, here's her chief complaint, here's some of the information, here's the last appointment, et cetera, here's her active conditions, like just kind of the high level overview. Let me get a little bit more detail. They can hit this expand or maybe even the review button. They think there's a little bit of what's the most intuitive there. And then get this kind of wider view where they can kind of essentially just grows and expands on the screen. And now they have this deeper view of, okay, here's a lot more information about the patient. And again, like this is still a little rough in terms of how how the information architecture is and the hierarchy and things like that, but it kind of shows a little bit more of that detail very easily. And so that's an important piece. Now, the other important piece here is the footer. And the footer, I think, is actually really interesting because the footer can contain actions for the user to take based on the module itself. So for instance, within an appointment, if they see the appointment, they can just begin that appointment, right? They can go into the encounter. Maybe it's a begin intake. Maybe it's write the note, whatever it is. Maybe it's reschedule, right? So like they get to it and like, oh, this person didn't show, reschedule. Now, the clinician in larger hospital systems may not do that, but if they're running their own practice, it's very likely that they're going to be doing a lot of these kind of admin things day to day, particularly very early on when they may not have a lot of extra nursing staff or admin staff. And so these kind of quick little actions can be really useful for them so that they can very easily dive into or just complete these tasks that they need to do without having to go into another part of the software or do other things. This is very similar to the quick actions that I talked about in my last building in public video, where we want to provide in context these actions that they don't have to go to new areas of the product. And so this whole system is designed to be quick and easy with these actions. Same thing with a medication list. Like you add a medication list, okay, let's just give you the ability to add new medication here. or something like when we're looking at medication detail, like refilling or changing the dose. These are things that would be very simple to do, or theoretically simple to do, but they need to be in line within that object. And so one of the next steps with these modules is to go in and say, okay, when you hit refill, what is that experience? And I think there's actually a possibility that it could kind of happen in line within the module itself. And that would be a really simple way to kind of have someone complete a workflow without needing to go and do a lot of different things in other parts of the product. So these are all just components that I built out in Figma. They're components that exist in my code base, and I can basically just pass certain props to them to say, I want to make these the button style. I want to provide these buttons as these actions or this text and things like that. And it makes it really simple and flexible to build out these modules, particularly for this module library, where you can see that, I don't always have the icon here, but these actions can be kind of populated depending on the type of module we're talking about or we're working with. And I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about here, particularly when it comes to getting this in front of a user. I want them to understand this. And, if you look at a Figma file, it is easy to understand that it's a Figma file. But if we look at it here in this context, either in this particular part of the app or, if you go into the actual demo itself, you would be able to see some of these other things. Looks like the app is frozen for some reason. Don't know why that's happening. But regardless, you can go and click through here yourself, and you can see that there is some of that happening in there, where you can go and kind of see these in context, and it gives you a little bit more of that kind of continuity there. So the next thing I want to discuss is some data viz. Now, this is something I'm exploring. Data viz is actually a little hard to build in Figma, I found, but you can see I've kind of started thinking about some data viz here with different pieces of this experience. So this lipid panel kind of visualization is one version of that. This summary kind of trends of like this hypertension, I guess this would actually need to be primary hypertension or just hypertension. So I'll just make that like that. But basically the idea here is that very similar to these modules, data visualization is kind of modular itself. And the reason that's important is because when looking at these pieces of information, if a physician is looking at this view, this card, this hypertension, they're going to want to know a couple things. One is the hypertension controlled by medication or diet or exercise or whatever it is? And two, what are those most recent readings? So we can kind of give a summary here. Priscilla was diagnosed with hypertension on January, blah, blah, blah. It was controlled with lisinopril, 5 milligram by mouth once a day. And the most recent blood pressure reading was 127/73. So that in of itself is all information that we have, and we can just use kind of very simple language processing to kind of fill that in. But that's giving them that kind of very high level summary, and then they can see more of that information. So the next most important thing probably is going to be that trends chart, right? And you notice that it's very, very simple. There's like essentially just maybe the last 5 or 6 readings, the kind of the distribution of what those readings are, and I envision you can hover over this and see the actual number, and then a little bit of a key, right? And so what I was thinking about here with this is to kind of begin to expand on this. So that was version 1. This is kind of getting into further versions here, which is more along the lines of showing different ways to kind of give a trends view to this. So like kind of a very like a snapshot view of this actual data for whatever the particular issue is. So this is just different ways of visualizing things, scale, range, just kind of the actual like kind of bar chart style. So there's just lots of different exploration there using color, trying to use color to indicate the actual information versus using color up here to kind of indicate the last version. And then using like different shapes to kind of show like here's this version, or here's this number essentially, right? And that's an important distinction. I've actually kind of pulled that from Apple Health. They do a really great job of that. But this is, I think, really important because what we can do is similar to the modules. We can actually give a expandable view of this. And this is something I'm currently still exploring, so this is very, very rough. But you can kind of see that you could almost expand this, and maybe this happens in the card, maybe it kind of is a thing that takes over the screen. But basically, then we can give more detail. So we could actually give like a very complete view of the blood pressure history here, kind of in this chart. And then maybe even on the sideline, we can give, each reading itself, right? So maybe there's a way to give out each reading. Maybe there's a little bit of information around, the diagnosis history or the kind of treatment history, treatment plans, whatever that looks like. But basically the idea is that we can then kind of, again, let users kind of let clinicians dig into the information as they need it. So with a blood pressure history, we probably just need to know the last couple of, readings. With something like weight or BMI, it might, again, maybe it's just the last couple of readings. But there are other things, I think, within things like oncology, where you might need much more granular detail very, very quickly about that particular diagnosis in terms of readings or tests and things like that. And I also think that this could work too for things like embedding like MRIs, CTs, X-rays, where you then give kind of the high level overview of like, here's the thing that we were talking about or looking at, and then here's the deeper view of it. And you can kind of maybe click and drag, whatever it is, annotate, things like that. So this is very, very early exploration. I'm looking forward to doing more of this. I'm still in kind of the general research phase, but this is where that's at right now. Now, the last thing that I'll just briefly touch on is chronic care management. Now, chronic care management, I was actually reading a study, and I'll see if I can find it, link it in the video description here, but the chronic care management seems to be an increasing challenge in the US healthcare system. Primary care physicians in particular deal with this a lot because as the population ages, it's more likely to have more patients with more conditions and taking more medications. Now, this is an interesting thing because there are a lot of care models out there that exist in terms of value-based care that attempt to kind of help manage, provide incentives to managing this proactively. Things like basically how much of your population can you kind of keep controlled in certain things. But beyond that, I'm thinking a lot about the UX challenge of chronic care management because in a lot of the situations, physicians may take care of a patient and they may have one or two chief complaints for a visit. Someone like me is only going to be going in for the doctor for one or two things at a time, generally speaking. When you get into those older age ranges or just people who have more chronic issues, it can be a bigger challenge to manage all of those things in a very condensed amount of time, particularly for physicians who work in kind of corporate medical practices within a hospital system or whatever it is. So one of the things I've been thinking about here is how to help manage and help do these things. And one of the things I'm kind of thinking about is how to create, because I started working on this card right here with the kind of this particular kind of condition management. And I started getting into the thought of, okay, but what if this person has hypertension and diabetes and is on dialysis and has rheumatoid arthritis and does all these things? And there's, you could feasibly say that there might be 7 or 8 of these cards that someone might need to add and look at, essentially. And suddenly we're kind of breaking a little bit of this system. Not completely, but we're pushing the limits of what the system is capable of delivering because you still have to add each of those cards. You still have to scroll back and forth across them. And it could be it's basically a whole thing. So one of the things I'm thinking about here is the management of conditions and the medications that come with them, because some conditions just have 1 or 2 medications. Some of them may have several medications, and they all kind of have overlapping, potentially, side effects and challenges and kind of, potentially even interactions together that may not be good for the patient. So this is a thing that I'm thinking about. This is kind of my biggest challenge right now is like, does this offer an opportunity in terms of UX to be a differentiator, basically? Like in the market, can I be a differentiator by helping and essentially targeting and helping physicians manage this type of patient, essentially a very complex care, chronic care, many complex chronic conditions patient. And to be honest, I don't have a lot of information about that quite yet. It's still something I'm thinking about. But I think it is very interesting because now it presents an opportunity to think about the overlapping nature of conditions and medications. I was talking to a physician earlier this month. We were looking at some of this stuff, and they said, I like seeing these summary views, but one of the things I really need to see is like, how does the medication interact with the condition? Like, what is the connection between the condition, the medication, and the kind of the lab results and things like that? So that's something I'm thinking about. Again, haven't gotten super far into it, but it's certainly an interesting thing to consider. So anyway, that's it. That's everything for Building in Public episode 2. I hope this was interesting to you. If you found it useful, or if there's anything that struck a chord for you, please let me know. I'd love to talk to you about it. I'd love to hear about it. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.